Welcome, everybody. Thanks for your patience. I'm super excited for this live session as we kick off 2025. We've got an awesome guest, Josef, who you guys are going to learn a ton from. But I'm Rob. Welcome to Chai and Coaching. Our goal at Chai and Coaching is to help you guys thrive and succeed in your cross-cultural journeys, whether it's study abroad, getting jobs. But today we're going to be talking about visas, immigration, and the upcoming Trump administration. So I know you guys have tons of questions. Guys have a lot to learn. I know there's a lot of worries, fears. We've gotten so many messages about those things since Trump won the election last fall. And so we're going to cover a lot of great stuff and do live Q&A plus a giveaway. But I want to welcome our guest, Josef. So Josef, please introduce yourself. You're new to our channel, and we'd love to learn about your background.
Yeah, so my name's Joseph. I used to be a visa officer with the U.S. State Department for about 7.5 years. Relevant to this conversation, that where my career took me is that I worked under Obama, Trump, and Biden. Right, so I've gone through 2 presidential transitions as a visa officer in visa assignments. What does it actually mean the day after a new president shows up? I also am available if you'd like to book me with consultations at Argo Visa. That is something that I do in addition to other forms of immigration related writing and advocacy as an ex-visa officer. So one thing I do miss about being a visa officer is doing the visa Q&As. You'd go on the consulate website, you go to Facebook, you'd go to a university, and you talk to people about what are their fears, what are their concerns. There's a lot of rumor, a lot of myth, and I think a lot of assumptions about how the U.S. immigration system works, especially as it becomes kind of a more charged and central discussion in American politics. So, this for me is really about answering your questions, alleviating anxiety, and giving people a realistic perspective on what a presidential transition actually means.
Yeah, and tell us, where have you worked and served as a consular officer?
Yeah, so I worked as a consular officer in Kolkata, India. I was there at the beginning of my career. And that was, at the window, renewing American citizens' passports, doing visas. I worked in Ankara, Turkey, where I was a specialist in Iranian visa cases, particularly and more generally third country nationals, which was basically like people from the region who were not from Turkey itself, right? Although I do speak Turkish and I did plenty of visas for Turkish nationals as well. And then later on, I worked in Washington, D.C., specifically on the Afghanistan Special Immigrant Visa Program. And then I also went back to India and finished my career with an assignment as a visa supervisor in the U.S. Consulate in Mumbai. So, in terms of a lot of things that are controversial or getting a lot of headlines in immigration, Indian H-1Bs, a potential Muslim ban, this is something that I've had firsthand and pretty deep knowledge of. And especially working in Turkey and the Middle East region, seeing a lot of the Muslim ban cases, dealing with that particularly, that is something that I had a lot of on the ground experience with. And I can tell you how that works and how that doesn't work, what applies and what doesn't in a general sense, and what you as an applicant would be likely to experience.
Awesome. So I'm excited to learn a lot. My friends, strap in, grab your chai, your coffee. But before we jump in, I want to know where you guys are tuning in from. I'm here in Dallas, Texas. Josef is there in Turkey. And so super cool to have him tuning in from across the world. But let us know in the chat where you guys are tuning in from. We'd love to see where our awesome audience is today. We got Jamaica. Welcome. Where else are you guys tuning in from? All right, we got Bangladesh, India, Nigeria. Very cool. Dubai, Ethiopia, and Nepal. Welcome, everybody. This is exciting. If you guys are watching the replay later, again, let us know in the comments where you guys are tuning in from. Yemen, Antigua, Brooklyn, New York. Very cool. We got the whole world tuning in. Boston. Very cool. Well, welcome everybody. We appreciate the patience for starting a few minutes late. We want to make the most of your time. Again, if you have a friend who's preparing for a visa interview, get them on this live session. They're going to really benefit from it. So, Josef, we're going to kick off. What was it like, for you working as a visa officer under the first Trump administration, and how can people learn from your experience?
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a situation where I think that, like, I want to separate like what it was like for that administration to come into office initially in the first couple of months, and then what wound up happening, right, in a longer term sense for the next 4 years, right? Because if you're in a situation where it was a surprise election result, I frankly don't even think the Trump administration themselves expected to win, but there they were, and suddenly they had to run everything. And really overwhelmingly, as a visa officer, what happened was it was an environment where staffing was very low and the tension around immigration politics was very high, which means that we'd see stuff happening like on Twitter or on the news and then be like, so what are we doing about that tomorrow? Right. There was a lot of confusion and not a lot of communication from Washington in the first couple of months. Right. And that was not fun. A lot of applicants had a very confusing time. The important thing to remember is the officers are usually also having a confusing time if that happens. Usually I think the thing I want to stress for applicants thinking about the visa officers and thinking about how the visa officers think is it's not like Trump's the president now, everyone thinks like Trump. Right? It's not like, oh, suddenly they're rude to me because the president said this, right? You are working in an office. The office is part of an organization. The organization is like the State Department or the State Department's Visa Bureau, right? You're 2 or 3 layers removed from Washington, just like the president doesn't say, do this and it's done, right? The president talks to a secretary. They talk to a head of a cabinet. The cabinet says, okay, this is how we can do it. This is how long it will take. This is how many people it will take. And so we were kind of just getting these releases from the White House directly. We were getting information about, this is forbidden and this is allowed. And we didn't really have instructions on how to do it. What does that mean? That means for like the first 3 or 4 months of the administration, like things were changing constantly. Right? Like, are these files going to be kept on paper? Are they going to be accepted? Do we tell people to come back later? Do we interview them now and give them a different answer? So what I really experienced from the first Trump administration as a visa officer was kind of a lot of chaos. We tried to do the best by the applicants in terms of, how would I say this? We didn't want to start speaking out of turn as low-ranking people and say what the president meant was this. So really what we did was a lot of time we didn't say anything, right? So especially if big immigration news happens, I would not expect the embassy or consulate to like tell you, hey, this is what's going to happen for your case now. Don't expect them to have press releases or media, especially in non-English language ready, and expect a lot of like 221G, being put in like kind of a hold status and being told to come back later. That is something that is, I'm sorry, my cat's being naughty. That's something that is, that's something that's possible. So the first, let's say 3 or 4 months were a lot of drama, a lot of confusion, and a lot of telling people, I don't know, let's wait. Right. That was not awesome from a professional perspective as a visa officer, but we tried to keep things manageable and convenient for ourselves. Now, obviously, if you travel to a different country for your visa interview and you're like, what do you mean come back in 2 weeks? I just flew here from Iran, or, I can't go back to Syria. That becomes a little more complicated. But, it took about, I'd say, 4 or 5 months for all the immigration changes that were implemented to really become part of standard operating procedure, and that's when it got to be the situation where we were treating people the same every day. There was a standard procedure. We had extra standard forms printed out. You'd come in, you'd interview, and we could really get to the substance of what happened. Right. As time went on, there were other bigger dramatic changes, but as the administration kind of got used to running things, they'd usually give us a little advance notice, like in the embassies or consulates, so we could be prepared and ready to implement things. On this date, this is going to happen. And then we'd all, take the afternoon off. We'd all read the briefing and PDF together. We'd be like, okay, that's the new policy. Because, when policy changes as a visa officer, like you usually hear about it from your immediate boss, who's heard about it from their boss, right? And then there's usually kind of that policy gets announced. And so you take a little while to train on it. You have a little questions. You go back and forth with DC. You're like, hey, what are the new standards? How are we treating this case, or how are we treating that case? And then it settles out. To put it bluntly, if there is a dramatic change in immigration policy, you're not going to know what normal looks like for a couple of months. Personally, I'm not going to say that I really fully understand what the second Trump administration considers to be a normal immigration policy until like May or June of this year.
So I think that's helpful. My big takeaway was things take time, especially in federal government, to trickle down. Immigration changes take time. Implementation takes time. There's these formal processes. So things just aren't going to flip overnight until things become official. And so hopefully that gives people some calm, that, hey, don't worry, things are going to be pretty smooth and normal and maybe gradually change instead of night and day, black and white after the 20th. Does that sound about right?
I mean, there are definitely policies that can be black or white. If a new travel ban is announced, or when certain things happened, for example, the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization, that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, part of the Iranian government, that was black and white. That changed overnight. It's not so much what the reality of the policy is, it's how the visa officers deal with it and how much the visa officer knows. A lot of people in their visa interviews, they're like, well, the visa officer walked away from the window a bit and came back with someone else. I don't know what was happening. Or like, the visa officer put my case in 221G, and then that afternoon I got an email about what happened. That means the visa officer didn't know what to do with your case, right? They're not all powerful, they're not all knowing, and they're not all seeing, right? And especially how things work in the American system, where frankly, like, the immigration law doesn't change very much, but the president gives orders to change how visa officers act. That is the part that takes time to trickle down. It's not so much that things don't change, it's that things don't become routine and things don't become well running for a little bit.
That's helpful to know. And so, kind of speaking of reality or new realities, things may change, but, based on your current experience, having worked in different administrations, what usually happens? What are typical expectations that people can, be ready for?
Yeah, honestly, absent the big high profile ones, like a potential Muslim ban or an announced prominent change to H-1Bs, right? Like in a basic sense, it is slow, and it's directions that come out of Washington, D.C. It's always like a process between the embassy in your country and Washington, D.C., right? So like, for example, like the issuance rates, generally speaking, for like student and tourist visas kind of track with like how well the economy of a given country is doing and what the periodic studies show about how well that nationality uses that visa, right? So, when people are like, I would say don't over assign things to a presidential administration when there's other factors going on. For example, Trump comes into office, then say your country undergoes an economic crisis and suddenly a lot of people are trying to immigrate, maybe some not legally, then you get your visa refused. Well, it's not the American president that changed the situation, right? It's the domestic situation in your own country, which has changed how visa officers look at generally how people qualify for visas, right? So other factors, like I see a question in the chat. Oh, did things get tighter? For some things they did between different administrations, right? But I also saw very big changes between like the beginning and middle of the Obama administration about certain types of visas, right? When I first arrived in India in 2014, there was quite a lot of scrutiny of student visas, right? But over time, as the numbers went up, as we saw that most Indian students, we got the statistical confirmation that they weren't like working illegally, that they were coming back when they said they were going to come back, things got a lot more relaxed. And by the time I left in 2017, it was, I think, a lot easier to get a student visa than it was in 2014. The types of concerns. Yeah.
So they were saying, is it going to get tighter? Maybe they were saying, between these different administrations, was there a major difference of trends, or was it you're basically doing the same job?
At the window, it's going to be the same job. At the window, bluntly, things don't move that fast, right? It's not like one day, last day of Obama, I'm coming into work and we're issuing 80% of students. And then first day of Trump, we're, rejecting 70% of students. It doesn't work like that. There's bigger trends that I think kind of forecast the daily behaviors, despite all of the drama, despite some of the very politicized policies, despite a lot of the heated rhetoric, at the end, remember that like the Immigration and Nationality Act, like the actual law didn't change. Like at the end of the day, you still have to qualify, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that frustrated me about the Muslim ban, there were many, I'm going to be open about that, was the fact that it would only apply to someone who otherwise qualified for the visa, right? You had to prove that you did qualify for the visa anyways. That also means a lot of people walked away being like, they didn't give me a visa because I was Iranian. I was like, well, I think you didn't get the visa because you didn't qualify, right? So, the basics of overcoming, if it's like a student visa or a tourist visa, overcoming 214B, right? The basics of being able to talk about like what you're doing and why you are doing it and how you're going to support it and what your plan is afterwards, that all stands, right? That all remains. But there are going to be, certain structural changes with more complicated visas, right? I do expect differences in what I'd call under the hood or in the back office process for like how H-1Bs are approved, the petitions are approved. I would expect a change in terms of the types of questions and how many questions like H-1Bs get, right? If that becomes a big issue where the White House is saying like, well, I don't know about H-1B fraud, or I'm very worried about H-1B misuse, then that is something that would trickle down to the embassies and consulates and be like, okay, let's start taking a closer look. I remember, and I'm using a lot of Obama examples just because that was a time where I saw a very not dramatic change in policy, right? Obama came to India in 2014 and he said, I love Indian students. We want there to be more Indian students. Right. And then the word from on top at the embassy in New Delhi to all the consulates was like, hey, you heard the president, right? Like, let's stop. Well, not bring him in, because there was some tension, because I remember raising my hand in a meeting with the ambassador and, from the back, a not important guy being like, does this mean we just issue everybody a visa? And he said, well, no. But what it does mean is that remember that part of your mission and part of what America wants out of this relationship with India is more Indians studying in America. And that happened. Right. When they basically said these are the changes of categories of what means that an Iranian would be considered a security threat. That's not a situation where I started looking at everyone and being like, I think you're a terrorist. I think you're a terrorist. It means I'm checking the list and I'm implementing the policy. Right. And that's how it'll work. Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, I think you painted a good picture of, things move slowly. Things are pretty status quo unless it's a big legal change. But maybe, Joseph, what are a couple of the big myths, rumors that get circulated, especially online, that we can kind of bust or clarify to help people, especially maybe thinking about a new Trump administration?
I think the number one thing, and I think about this in terms of what I hear from people who've been rejected, right, is everyone's like, I think this is why I got rejected. I think this is why I got rejected. Everyone has a theory of why I got rejected. Now, no one ever has a theory of, I think this is why I got approved, right? If you get approved, you're not asking questions about like, hey, why did that happen, right? You're like, of course I did. I deserved it. Don't over project. Don't over project or over politicize. Although, like, I do think there is a level of politics to the visa process, particularly when it comes to countries whose governments are not friendly with the United States. Don't over politicize what happened in your particular visa interview, because oftentimes the concerns are like more basic, right? What I see, example for Iranians, I've seen several Iranians here, salam, who are asking about why are F1 visas so hard to get, right? And what's really driving that right now is statistically rates of immigration. Right. It's that, if we know that if you issue, if you add up a list and you say, this is how many Iranians came into the United States and this is how many Iranians left it during that time, and that list doesn't add up, it doesn't matter if they change status legally or not. You're going to be like, well, they all emigrate. Right. That is a bigger driver of Iranian refusal rates, right, is immigration intent than big political questions. I think most of the people who, for example, by no fault of their own, were, say, conscripted into mandatory military service in the IRGC, which is a designated terrorist organization. They're not going to the visa interview. They know that happened, right? And they're like, maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe I should go study in Germany until the political situation changes, right? Maybe I should look at Europe. Maybe I should go to Singapore. Who knows? The people who go in and they're like, it was some big political thing, and it's because my dad worked for this company that works for the Iranian government. It's like, well, no, it's because you've already got 2 sisters who live in Los Angeles. You've got 3 cousins who live there. You only applied to schools in Iranian neighborhoods of Los Angeles, and you have no plan for going back to your country, right? At a basic, at a basic level, like you still got to qualify. So politics is going to change things. If you're an H-1B worker, you're going to expect more aggressive questioning from a presidential administration that's made it clear that they have misgivings or concerns about the H-1B program, right? So a lot of, what's your job? How much do you get paid? How much of an expert are you? What exactly are you doing in a given day? Who do you report to? What are your duties? There's different areas of concern that emerge in different kind of political senses, but by that, I mean areas of concern, right? To get an H-1B, you still need to meet the qualifications. You still need to have an approved petition, right? And so there are exceptions. Sometimes those exceptions are broad. Sometimes big political things happen to large numbers of normal people who are just trying to live their lives. But even within that, like, the basic structure doesn't change as much. I'd say that's the biggest false visa myth, is that you're going to see 100% change from Obama from Obama to Trump, from Biden to Trump. And it's usually, to be blunt, concerns about restrictions. No one, when Biden came in, I think everyone was like, oh, things are going to get more relaxed. In a lot of ways, they didn't. Right.
Yeah,
in a lot of
rejections.
Ways, a lot of ways, there's a lot of rejections. And for certain demographics and certain groups of people, things got quite bad for them under the Biden administration. And that was because of policies that were maybe not coming from the White House, but were still things that administration was pursuing. And that made it very difficult. I know there's a lot of F1 students who were victims of fraud who, had a rough time being refused under very harsh refusal codes for things that, for basically getting scammed. That happened under the Biden administration, right? A lot of what was it called? Like Wirecutter, not Wirecutter. That's a product review site, but it was there were a couple bad companies that did some bad stuff and got shut down. And a lot of the people who'd done OPT with them wound up with fraud refusals, even though they were the victims of the scam. Unfortunately, that happened under the Biden administration. So like, let's not assume that it's some presidents are dragons and some presidents are teddy bears. This is an immigration system that can still be difficult if you don't know what's going on about that. Yeah.
No, that's great. We've got a poll on YouTube here. What visas we got? Looks like 52% student visa, 7% work visa, 30% tourist visa, 10% immigration visa. So we got a variety of people watching today. Yeah. So thanks for filling out that poll. We're getting excited to answer some of those questions. But yeah, let's this is kind of our special big chai question for you guys. And what we really want to wrestle with is, what immigration visa concerns do you have about Trump? Let us know, answer those in the comments. Those are the questions we really want to address during the Q&A that's coming up in just a little bit after the giveaway. So be thinking about this. If you guys are watching this recording later, again, throw this in the comments. We want to see what your questions are, what's your concerns, and how we can help out, how we can make more content, how you can get coaching and the right resources to be the best prepared, because we really want to help you guys get those approvals. And if you guys didn't know, both us at Chai and Coaching and our friends at Argo Visa also have other great resources on social media, websites, newsletters, a lot of great things. I'm going to be sharing some links for you guys to check out, a lot of great free resources. So please check that out. Those things are going to help you guys out in your journey outside of this live session today. But we want to cover a couple more topics before we jump into the Q&A, and just maybe hypothesize. Again, we don't really know until all things happen. So I want to clarify that we're not fortune tellers. But what are, Joseph, what are some possible differences during Trump 2.0, especially he's going to be surrounded by different people in a different cabinet this time. Yeah. So what are your thoughts?
So let's look at minimum, maximum, right? And let's think about minimal difference and maximal difference. am of the opinion that I think that overall the U.S. immigration system has been trending in a harsher direction in the time that I've been in it and that I've been following it, right? That's just been the reality of the last decade. I don't really see that the Biden administration meaningfully became like nicer, although there were certain areas, for example, spouses of people in the United States who had been undocumented had a better path to regularize their status. The other thing is you have to remember when people talk immigration in the United States, and you see the news headlines of Americans are mad about immigration, Americans are mad about this, about that. There's really two conversations. There's what's happening at the US border in Mexico and everything else, right? And people kind of forget everything else, right? And when I say like, I write about immigration or I talk about immigration, but I don't speak Spanish and I have no idea what, how asylum processing works. People are like, what are you doing here, right? And the thing is the visa system kind of gets forgotten because it happens outside the United States and it's administered by a relatively small number of people. Minimum case, theoretically, nothing much happens. Some security screening gets a little tighter. H-1B visas, get more requests for evidence and kind of more requests for evidence, more RFEs that would probably come at the petition approval side. If we're talking about the H-1B cap coming in with USCIS. At the visa interview itself, maybe officers get some guidance after like 6 or 8 months or a year. It comes down, hey, Washington wants to see us ask a couple more questions about H-1Bs. And, the fraud prevention unit in Mumbai gets a little busier trying to find fake companies and bad companies, right? That's the minimum. Maximum is a lot. I mean, the president has a lot of power to do everything. Remember, like the president could ban Canadians if they wanted to, right? Like, I mean, when you actually start, it could happen, right? Like the legal cases are there. There are people different in the Trump administration. Certain people, like Stephen Miller, who has, very harsh opinions towards certain groups of people, certain nationalities, certain religions, even if I can say, he's still there. And a lot of these, the hard work, what I talked about, the chaos, the administration officers not knowing what happened, we fixed all of that when I was working, like we made it run well, right? So it's just you flip a switch, be like, these countries, I don't want them in. Now, within something like the Muslim ban, even though by the end it mostly covered African countries, right? It expanded, it had strong variations of harshness from country to country. It wasn't like the same for everyone. So there were some countries where it was basically like no tourist visas for government officials. You're on the ban list. And most people would never even notice that happened. If you're talking about like Nigeria or Niger. Some countries are like, we're not giving any immigrant visas. Nobody, right? There was a lot of exemptions and waivers to that, especially for immigrant visas. If you've got an immigrant visa filed and the harshest possible stuff happens, at the other end of an immigration petition is an American green card holder or resident. And that means you've got a legal right to bring your relatives to America, right? That means court battles, that means exemptions for immigrants, but that also means no tourist visas at all for certain nationalities. That means no student visas at all for any nationalities. Last time Iranian students got a better deal because Iranian students were felt to be this wasn't really about them. This time, I don't know if that's going to be the case, right? So if there is a Muslim ban, if it comes back for Iran, considering how harsh things are for Iranian students right now, I don't see them being exempted from the ban. Does that mean case-by-case waivers could still exist? I don't know. That's going to depend a lot. So, there's an element of unpredictability, but that also rests in basically the structure we have in the US where there's the law and then there's policy of the State Department or USCIS, which are two very different things. If you're in a legally based process, and by that I basically mean immigrant visas, right? If you're in a, things can be done that can slow that down that might not even be related to government policy or immigration policy. Immigration policy, very related to government policy. There are things that could slow down immigrant visas. You need major legal changes to stop that in most cases. Other stuff could potentially change quite a lot, depending on what the president says or does or whatever crisis approaches. Be ready for it. The thing that I think could surprise people, what wasn't done last time and what could happen now, is frankly a level of questioning about your political beliefs, right? And your social media presence, right? Remember in US law, there's a standard in concerns about like support for terrorism, which is like supporting or espousing it, right? Like, this is it's on the books. No one's ever really used it. I certainly never used it. And I didn't really, as a visa officer, have the chime to go and check people's social media, right? Like if I saw one of my officers when I was supervising them and they were going through someone's Instagram, I'd be like, you're not looking for a girlfriend on the visa line. Okay. Knock it out of that door. Right. And, like a lot of officers tend to be young, right? Like, you're on your first or second assignment, you're in your 20s, you're talking to someone, you're like, hey, how's it going? Other countries are more relaxed about that. The US is very strict. You're not supposed to be talking with people or meeting with someone. If a visa officer is ever like, I like you, let's meet later, that's a huge red flag, and they could get in major trouble at their job for doing that. Right. So,
okay.
But there's a potential for some kind of executive order or something to be like, do you support any of the following terrorist groups? Have you even spoken kindly about them? Or do you there's no definition for that. But like, remember the way US law works is it's what the US government considers a terrorist organization, not what you personally consider to be terrorism or legitimate or not. Like, it's not a moral thing. It's like, there's this list of organizations. And if you said something related to them, at the outside of the most extreme measures for visas, that's what I'd be concerned about. Right. And, it's also just a good idea before a job interview or a visa interview to just be a little more chilled out about your political beliefs. Right. I mean, I think anyone who's gone through the experience does that. I've been through the visa and immigration process myself, just like not as a diplomat, but just as a private citizen in both India and Turkey. And like, I've done that. I've been called into the interview. I've been asked uncomfortable questions, and like, you keep it civil, you keep it chill. You're not there to make a political point if you really need to be there. So at the minimum, it's basically now, but a little bit more in certain areas, which is still not a great situation for a lot of people. And the worst case scenario is it could be a situation where, depending on your passport, certain visa classes are closed to you, and there might be more political type questions asked or about your social media posts or your personal beliefs. That's, I'd say, the minimum and the maximum in terms of how it would break down.
That's helpful.
The answer will probably be somewhere in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know Trump ran on a really strong immigration platform, especially to curb the illegal immigration, trying to close the border, dealing with things like that. But it'll be interesting to see if there's any kind of ripple effect or trickle down towards.
Remember, different agencies, different cultures, right?
Okay,
what's happening at the border is not the same thing. Now, DHS or the Border Patrol guys, they're at embassies and consulates. They're working more and more with the State Department. There's a lot more agencies working together. That's less, I'm asking you a question in a visa interview, and more like, I've got a list of like people we don't like and I'm looking for them. Right. That's a very different type of relationship.
Okay.
Right?
Well, that's good.
And when you hear like CBP or I think it's called HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, is present at embassies and consulates, and they showed up, when I was during the Trump administration. That was actually a major change, which was just kind of internal. Suddenly there's this like kind of cowboy talking Texas guy with a badge and a gun walking around my office. And I'm like, who's he? And they're like, oh, that's Tom. Like, he works here now. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, he was helpful pulling up criminal records. So that, that's stuff that kind of happens under the hood. In terms of what you're going to see in a lot of areas, especially with a lot of the questions I'm seeing in terms of like 214B concerns, people getting rejected, things like that. I don't really honestly see that that's necessarily going to change. But I don't want to talk too much. I want to give time for Q&As. There's one more thing I do want to say when I said that there's overall government policy. If you have a presidency or you have a president that's really into cutting the number of government employees, thinks there doesn't have to be so many people, but also does want to also wants to take a closer look at immigrants, those two things together are going to mean way longer wait times for USCIS. Now, that would sound kind of nuts in a situation where we didn't just have a pandemic, right? And honestly, a lot of the petition wait times and stuff like that has never really come down since COVID, And like, that's more of a conversation about things not getting better rather than things getting dramatically worse. Wait times everywhere are low. When I left the State Department, we were looking at the spreadsheets about like, how are we going to make up for 2 lost years of international travel? That doesn't even come into like immigrant visa processing. So like, I would expect things to go a bit slower, to be honest.
Okay.
Especially in certain high attention areas. I would expect skilled work visas to get more scrutiny. And, I would expect, certain areas of the world, broadly the Middle East region, to expect a little more politicization of their categories of travel. But what that actually means for you is really going to depend on how exactly the policy gets articulated.
Sounds good. And real quick, just because you had worked in India and a big part of our audience is Indian, I want to hit this real quick before the giveaway and Q&A. But maybe just what are a couple of the biggest mistakes that you saw, working there in Mumbai and Kolkata, that you would want to address to help our friends who are preparing for visa interviews this year?
Cultural communication moment, right? And this was the #1 cultural miscommunication I saw that just wrecked Americans in an office. What kind of company do you have? Company. What kind of company? Private company. What kind of private company? Oh, business. What kind of business? Oh, we buy and sell. What do you buy and sell? We buy and sell commodities. I'm losing it. I can already feel my blood pressure rising, right? When Americans are asking about your job, your parents' job, or stuff like that.
We want details.
You want a detail. What I always say is sector and scale. Give me the type of company, the sector of the economy it works in, and the relative size of it. People would be like, it's blah, 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 all India private limited. I'm like, I'm sitting here Googling a Maruti Suzuki dealership in MP, right? And I'm just like, I don't know what that is. Be clear, be specific, right? My father owns a mid-sized 2-dealer dealership, and we have agricultural land valued at 8 crores. That's a great answer. Right? I'm doing own business is not a good answer. And that's going to kind of set the visa officers off. The other thing I think, particularly in an Indian cultural context, is you don't have to give just one answer to things, right? Okay. You don't have to, like, it's not the same process of bureaucracy. And I've dealt with Indian bureaucracy a lot, like not just as a diplomat going and sorting things out between governments, but like last summer opened a bank account in Calcutta, and that was kind of exhausting, right? There's a lot of forms, there's a lot of paperwork.
I've been there. I know it.
I've been there. Yeah, they're like, oh yeah, the text is coming today, sir. And I'm like, a lot of people will be like, this is my sponsor. And then not mention like, oh, but my mother also works and she's a professor and she's really rich. And it's like, well, I thought I had to say that. I still remember this. The closest I've ever come to refusing a visa applicant ever was this girl in Mumbai who was applying for a student visa. And it's like, okay, who's paying for this? Oh, my father. What does he do? Oh, he runs a flower shop. And I'm like, okay, like you're going to a pretty expensive private school. Like it was one of the like NYU or Columbia. I was like, how's he going to afford this? How much do you make a year? Oh, 3 lakh. I'm like, well, I mean, you got into a good school, but this doesn't financially make sense. And she's like, oh, but that's just his retirement job. What do you mean it's his retirement job? Yeah. He's just done that. I mean, he was in the IAS for 25 years. Right. And I was just like, okay, so what you do is you lead. Visa officers are trying to get, it is not something that's about specifics. It's about generalities. Right. And I want to know generally what's the situation.
Big picture.
You can give more than one answer. A lot of Indian applicants I've noticed, and having in dealing with Indian bureaucracy, you can put the one thing down, you have the one gap, you got to write it out in block letters, blue pen, and it's got to be right. Right. This doesn't work that way. Right. So you can fill them in on a little bit more context. There's no one right answer. The right answer is the totality of your circumstances. Other than that, lakhs and crores rupees for talking about properties and stuff. In India, talk about dollar amounts when you're talking about finances in America. That's my advice on that one. Yeah. Good tip.
So lots of potential mistakes, I think, across the whole world, across cultures and communication. But one thing that you guys at Argo Visa specialize is coaching, prepping, overcoming refusals, mock interviews. Tell us real quick what you guys can offer to help people get that approval.
Yeah. So, I mean, like the Argo service is a really personalized service, right? Like it's not like, okay, here's what to say. Like we don't do that. And that's, if you're looking for that, this is not the right place to come. Right. But what we do is a situation for you to, the #1 complaint I have is the officer didn't give me the time to explain myself. We give the time. right? You fill out a questionnaire, you let us know about your circumstances, you come to us, and I look at you first as a person, get all the information, all the context, and then I look at you as an officer, right? And then we go through the process of how this stuff translates into an actual interview, right? A lot of us have a lot of experience. A lot of us have language ability. A lot of us have, worked in the countries and pretty recently kind of understand the norms. So this is a chance for you to kind of do a cold run through and be like, well, how is this actually going to go in practice? Right. Not just what's a good thing to say. There's a lot of people who like say this and you'll get approved. It really doesn't work like that. What Argo is really about is translating your experience in life and the way that you qualify, because I do think most people qualify, right? Is translating those circumstances into ways to help the visa officer make a decision, right? It's about taking what you want to say and really getting down to, okay, out of that, what does the visa officer really want to know? Because one things that I've noticed that kind of frustrated me when I was a visa officer is I know this person's trying to tell me something, but they're trying to tell me something that's not relevant to this conversation, right? And so what we can do at Argo is there's 30, 45-minute, an hour-long kind of packages, varying levels of service within that. But basically, you read through your questionnaire, you write in your questions beforehand, we answer those, we talk about your situation, we develop a strategy, right? Not a memorized thing where we tell you, but a strategy for how to approach the visa interview. And then we practice, right? And some of the stuff is big and strategic, and some of the stuff is just like, hey, you got to remember to breathe, right? It's not just what's the profile, what's the paperwork, but how does that play in an interview?
Yeah, the value of a mock interview is huge, especially getting the right coaching. There's so much bad advice online, or you go to these consulting people in your home country who've never done a visa interview themselves. Yeah. Be careful of that. And then on their website, I shared a link. They have the visa checkup tool. It's a free resource. You plug in about 12 questions of your details, and it's going to spit out an answer on green, yellow, red, how prepared and how likely you're going to get approved or rejected. And that can maybe help you think, maybe I do need a coaching call. So check that out. But to help you guys out, we're going to do a giveaway, a special discount for a coaching session with Argo Visa. So to qualify, what you guys do in the chat, type hashtag 2025. Only need to do it one time. It's only going to count once. But if you want to be involved in this giveaway, type hashtag 2025 in the comments. We'll give you guys a moment to do that. And we're going to do a special giveaway. So I'm going to pull up our screen here. There you go. You guys are doing it. Hashtag 2025. We'll give you a few seconds to do that. All right, there we are. And it's only going to count you once, so no need to put it in multiple times. We'll give you guys about 10 more seconds. This is going to get you a 40% off, the biggest discount that Argo can offer for their amazing coaching services. All right, so yeah, hashtag 2025. We got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, everyone. Thanks for tuning in this long. We're about to do the live Q&A, and let's see who the lucky winner is. Who do we got? Durga, congratulations for being our winner. So cool. Thanks for participating in that. Durga, if you can share, you can message me online, send an email, but we need to get your email contact, and then I'll pass it on to Argo to make sure you get that. So Durga, yeah, share your email with me, and then we'll make sure that gets discount attributed to you. So what we've been waiting for, my friends, is the live Q&A. Again, thanks for the patience with the late start. And I mean, Joseph, you've been awesome. You guys hit that like button, say thanks, give some love to Joseph for how awesome he's been so far.
I'm loving all these questions.
Yeah, we're going to rapid fire as many as we can in our time remaining to help you guys out. We're going to, again, only ask your question one time. If you keep asking it again and again, I'm not going to pick it. Ask complete sentences in your questions so that we can understand. It's hard to know and answer incomplete questions. And then we're going to prioritize super chats. So we can't get to every question. So if you've got one that you're burning, really need answered today, drop a super chat and we'll make sure we get those ones prioritized and answered today. So let's get this party started. I think this one's pretty relevant. Melvin's asking, how much of an impact do you think the Doge, that's Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, Department of Government,
Efficiency.
The Efficiency Commission has exposed mass federal layoffs. Will this affect visa applications?
Yeah, if that happens to the extent that they've kicked around, that would be pretty catastrophic. I mean, if they're really talking about like firing half of federal employees, you're already looking at double the wait time for visas. The likelihood of it being that extreme, I would not bet a lot of money on that, no matter what the cryptocurrency markets are saying or whatever. But I would say that what's more likely is there's likely to be hiring freezes, and there's likely to be much more flexibility based off of how hiring works and how these government agencies are run. There's likely to be a bigger difference among how fast USCIS goes domestically inside the USA rather than the number of visa officers abroad. Right. And we don't have time to get into why that is. But if there are hiring freezes, if there are government cuts, it's probably going to come to USCIS much harsher than visa officers abroad. Now, it doesn't mean that new embassies and consulates won't grow, more capacity won't be added, wait times won't go down that fast. The big hurt, if there are mass federal government layoffs, in my opinion, would be immigrant visa processing times and petition-based visa processing times. Your EB2 NIWs, your O2s, and your immigrant visas and your H-1Bs would be the ones really, really hit by that if it happens in a realistic way. If they actually fire half of U.S. government employees, that's going to be a pretty rapid reduction in services. It would not be good from a visa perspective. But that's less likely than just a slowdown and a lack of hiring.
Okay, great. We got a two-part here from Rohan. Yeah. He's saying, I was approved J1 during the Trump administration, then got rejected on the Biden term because I was still young and a student. Later, if I apply on Trump and able to support myself, will my history help me? And then he continues with, will there be a possibility where the officer is thinking he is approved under the first Trump administration, given the face circumstances have changed?
Oh, no, it doesn't work like that at all. Right? Like that, it's not a situation of like Trump said yes, now Biden said, like it's not Joe Biden or Donald Trump's particular opinion of you particularly, Rohan. Right. So, it is much more when you look at time, like when you look at approvals before saying something good and then, something later changing, it's more about circumstances in your country. Right. Okay. So, for example, if a Syrian national comes to me now and they're like, I'd like to go for a tourism visa. And I saw that they got a tourism visa like during the civil war in that country. It must be like, wow, we really trust this guy because things were really bad then and they're better now. I should probably give them a visa, although it would not work that way in that particular case. It's not about the presidential administration. In your case, multiple refusals don't ever help under any circumstance. If you were approved J1 and then got rejected, you just have one refusal, and then got rejected and then apply again, you'll have to kind of qualify on your own terms, right? It's more about your specific application history rather than who was in charge at that time.
Great. Thanks for clarifying that. All right. We got Stanislava. Thank you for the super chat. Their question is, what is my chance for a B2 if I'm accompanying my husband to the US so he can get a visa for my country? Self-employed, has insurance there, been to 6 countries, 5 months required.
The ones that I'm least comfortable saying these are your odds, these are your chances are B1, B2s, because those are the most, because they ask the least and there's the least written about the actual requirements. That means they take the most times. When you are a visa officer and you're being trained, the last type of visa that your bosses will let you do unsupervised is B1, B2, simply because it's so wide ranging. Like the number of things I don't know about this conversation, like it is a valid purpose of travel to say, I need to accompany my husband to be present for my country's visa process in the United States. At the same time, you've got a husband inside the United States, and just having that kind of close tie could present complications for a B1, B2. But honestly, without talking to you in depth about it, it's really hard for me to say like chances. And generally speaking, honestly, I don't give like percentage chances at Argo. You know, I think that we can evaluate your position, but I can't like give you a computer scan and be like, you are 62% likely. You know, I can say like, you're looking good. This needs some work. This is bad. And sometimes the outcome of an Argo consultation is after talking for 30 minutes or 45 minutes. I'm like, hey, I don't think this is going to happen, which I don't like to do. But I do think, you know, my clients deserve honesty when things really are in a tough way. That's mostly for like crime stuff, though.
Yeah. And then they also asked, is there more scrutiny if someone is self-employed? Is that a factor at all?
I don't like it, but it also, I think you're thinking in too mechanical a way, right? Okay. Like, oh, I put this down on the DS-160 and it means this. I mean, are you self-employed and really rich? Because that's great. Are you self-employed and maybe making an inconsistent amount of money per month, from month to month? That's not great. The officers, when they're evaluating 214B ties, are basically looking at this question of like, is your life better if you go do what you say you're going to do and go home, versus is your life better if you use this B1, B2 to just stay in America, legally or illegally, right? I could be thinking, well, this person's never going to be out of status a day in their life. This person's going to instantly get an H-1B or an employment green card offer, and it's all going to be legal. And I can still deny them based off of that, right? I've done it. Right. That's the way the visa officer's duties work. So is there more scrutiny if you're self-employed? Generally, yes. I mean, the ideal job is a high salary position from an international company that everyone readily knows. Right. If you're like, oh, yeah, I'm an executive at, you know, insert the most famous company in your country. We all love that. It makes our decisions very easy. Mm-hmm. Self-employed, that's going to be a case by case basis.
Gotcha. All right. Here's this one. I think you'd maybe mentioned it earlier. I can't remember, but Prince is asking, how will the second Trump term affect immigrant visas like IR2, IR1, CR1, those kind of ones?
Probably slower processing of the petition itself for a variety of reasons, right? There might also be more scrutiny about like the financial support of immigrants in the United States. Last time there was more strict provisions for what was called public charge, of basically like, are you going to be reliant on government assistance, or do you have people in the United States willing to support you? Right. Mm-hmm. And that could be it. A little more look at the financials and slower processing times, unless, you know, I don't know the nationality, unless you're in a travel ban affected country or like a Muslim ban affected country, in which case you need to make the argument to the U.S. officer that you would qualify for a waiver or exemption from that ban, which for an IR2 specifically was usually like, hey, I've got immediate family in the United States and they'd be harmed by me not being there, right? Mm-hmm. But generally, I think we've actually kind of covered this pretty extensively in terms of what the immigrant visa situation would look like.
Sounds good. I like this one from Jutin. Just a quick question. How much do you write on the refusal notes? Are you writing a lot or shorter, or, you know, what does the visa officer write down?
Yeah.
They refuse someone. What's behind the scenes?
I'm going to get a little literary, and I'd always say, like, you know, you write like Hemingway, not Karl Marx, right? Like I want short sentences. I don't want whole paragraphs, right? Like, you know, the officers are typing, the notes are there and need to be justified. They're reviewed by your boss. At the end of the day, I was reviewing them. I was not. You know, generally as a visa officer, the length of it is like, how much is relevant? Are you wasting time? Are your notes consistent? And do they show a good decision, right? Because you could see some officers kind of listing the pros of an applicant and then the cons and then the pros. And then be like, well, actually, there's still some cons. So I think I'm going to refuse them. And I'm like, what are you doing here? Is this like your internal thoughts? Like, give me a call, make the call, do it. Generally, if you're at a busier post, the emphasis is tight notes. Right? Like if I'm working in a place like, you know, like Tijuana or Guangzhou or Mumbai or Hyderabad, you're not getting more than a sentence or two. Right?
Okay.
It also depends on how complicated the case is. Right? So for example, you know, if there is someone with a complicated case, I'm going to write way longer notes because that decision is based off of my justification. right? So if I'm writing notes for a case for, say, someone who had a criminal record a long time in Turkey and a long time ago, but now their kids live in the US and they're coming there and it's been so long that it's not relevant anymore and the crime wasn't serious, I'm going to be writing a lot about that, right? Because I don't just be like, this guy was a criminal once, but he's okay now. My name's Joseph. It's okay, right? I don't want my name on that, right? So generally speaking, if you get refused and your refusal is short, that's actually good, right? Because it could just be 214B, doesn't qualify now, suspicions about ties, doubt intent. If you have a real long interview, right, and the visa officer records everything about you and everything you say and still says no, that's going to be really tough to overturn, right?
Gotcha.
Because if the officer goes through and sometimes you're like, wow, you really didn't like this guy, because sometimes there are reasons you just don't like the guy, Oh, I went to the US once before and I drove drunk and, beat up my wife and got arrested a bunch. And, now I'm standing at the window telling you need to give me a visa because I'm rich and important. That's an actual guy I remember from Kolkata, right? I wrote a long list of notes about him because I was like, you're a bad person and
you're not coming.
You're rude to everyone around me and you committed a bunch of crimes, when you went to the United States. And I wrote very long notes about that, which means that the next officer is going to have a very hard time doing that. Right. So short refusal notes are, believe it or not, actually good. The officer asked me one question and then said, no, believe it or not, that's the easiest kind to get out of here. Where it's basically like, what? You're a young guy from Haryana. I'm refusing you based off of that. Right. That means your next interview, you could be like, this is where I'm going. This is why I'm studying it. This is who's
can change some things.
What I'm doing afterwards. You can change that story. Right. Yeah. If we're going deep down, this guy gave me this document and said, if I had this fake degree, then he'd give me a visa, but only I have to pay them the rest of the money when I went to the United States. That is not good. Right. So, how much do we write? It depends on the case. The extreme ends, the really good cases tend to be yes. Right. Very short, married couple, both doctors going to see their child who's studying at City University of New York. Right. There we go. Wonderful. Yeah. Easy.
This is
long
insightful.
Notes. You're not having a good time. Yeah. Long notes. You're not having a good time. Yeah.
Great. Suzette's got an interesting one. I was invited to my aunt's graduation, which is in 2 weeks, but didn't get an appointment till March. So she's missing that. So when she goes for that visa interview, how can they convince the visa officer that they couldn't get the earlier date, but still have a ticket and hope to still go tour America?
So I'm going to give kind of a strange example, but I'm going to bring it around to talk about like what's really going on here. Because what I'm hearing is my purpose of travel isn't valid anymore, but can I still go? Because I've gone through the trouble of doing all this, right? Remember, you don't need to show a ticket to get a US visa. That's usually a requirement for like European visas. Here's my hotel reservations, here's my flight ticket. It doesn't really work that way in the US system. People have given me their tickets. I'm like, why'd you buy tickets if you don't have a visa? That makes no sense, right? But there's this basic question of what's my purpose of travel? And if that's not valid, do I still get to go? Remember, you wanting it more doesn't make you more qualified. Actually, kind of the opposite. Generally, the people who seemed the least excited about going to the United States were the easiest to prove, hey, I'm not going to stay there, right? But the other thing here is, okay, I got the appointment in March and I'm still going. We had an internal rule that we called like the Disneyland rule, which was like if an officer came to me as their supervisor, or if I came to my supervisor, early in my career, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Do I give this person a visa or not? And they ask you, if this person was going to Disneyland, would you give them a visa? So like, think about it. If this isn't about your aunt's graduation, if it's not about the family wedding, if it's not about a funeral, if it's not about a major life event, right? And the question is, do you qualify or not? Right. So instead of being like, it's my aunt's graduation, it's in 2 weeks, it's in March, it's this, it'd be like, my aunt's in the US. I'd like to visit them on a family trip. These are my ties in life to my home country. These are my finances. This is why going on vacation and coming home is better than using my B2 to get to the United States and never coming back. It's the same basic question, right? So don't lean too heavily on specific circumstances. Now, sometimes a purpose of travel can explain why someone who wouldn't normally travel would, right? But generally speaking, the purpose of travel is not as important as the applicant themselves. Remember, like, you are being interviewed for a US visa.
Yeah.
The school you got into, not your cousin, not how cute your little niece or nephew is, at the, going for the first rice ceremony or something like that. You, right?
Yeah.
And everyone has to
story make
qualify on
sense?
their own. And does your story, and does your story make sense?
Yeah.
Because I remember I had a specific case from India where a guy was like, well, I'm going. I'm like, you're a young guy. You just started your job. You say your uncle's going to pay for the plane ticket. You're going to a cousin's wedding, which is like red flag, for like young men traveling by themselves. Why are you going? Why are you leaving this job? You've only been at it for, a couple months. Why are you doing this? And he was just like, because all my other relatives live in countries with longer visa delays. They can't make it to this wedding. And if nobody from my family comes, it's going to look like we don't approve of the wedding. And that side of the family is going to be mad at us for 80 years. Right. And I was like, that just made sense to me. Okay. Why would a young guy drop everything and be sent by his family to his cousin's wedding? Well, he managed to explain it, because the alternative is this family has some
shame,
very, very bad argument that will be brought up forever. Right. There's always an explanation. That's a bit of an extreme case, though. In the end, you still need to qualify on your own terms.
Great. All right. Here's a three-parter from Daniel. Rejected 2 times by U.S. Embassy in Pakistan, once on a B1, B2.
Yeah.
There is a minor, and once as an F1 in 2022. Both times there was no travel history. Now traveled 2 times to KR and Jordan. Is there any chance I can apply, Ken, and secure a visa? I'm a single young student.
Okay, so a couple of things. One, if every single young student was not given a visa, there would be no foreign students in America, because single and young are the people who do it. You're asking the wrong questions, I think, right?
Okay.
There's also another question I like here. I was refused once as a minor, and then again, in 2022. Let's not even really think about that application when you were a child, because the consideration of 214B is really more about your overall circumstances and stories. If you're a minor, that means your parents are taking you to a tourist visa interview, and it means that they don't qualify, right?
Yeah.
If I see your biometric data pop up in the computer and I see a baby looking back at me, I'm not really holding any of that against you. Right? Because how are you going to do that? And I've had to do that sometimes when I'm clearing out previous refusals. It's like previous refusal, I just said applicant is a baby. And that just is like, that happened as a minor. So that's not really a big deal. If your entire family comes in 8 times looking for tourist visas and you get refused every time, and the officer is like, this family is trying to illegally immigrate, that's maybe a bigger question. But generally, if it was a long time ago, these things kind of fade with time. And there's a lot of people who've been refused who 10, 15, 20 years later come back and they're like, my purpose of travel is different. I'm going for a different visa, and it's a different situation. Don't worry about that. But the other thing is this question of international travel, right? The reason they ask about international travel isn't about how many countries have you been to, and when you travel to enough countries, there's a magic number and you get a visa. What they're actually really interested in is if you travel to countries with strict immigration regimes. And this is because countries with strict visa processes kind of boost off of each other, right? A lot of countries will let you travel there easier if you have a US visa, because their philosophy is, like for Indians in Jordan or other nationalities, their philosophy is, well, if the Americans check this guy out and they say he's okay,
he's probably good.
If this young lady has been checked out by the Americans, that looks pretty good. My happiest thing I saw was an Australian visa, because the Australians are brutal. They love refusing people. And I'm like, if they manage to get an Australian one, like Japan, Australia, certain kinds of UK visas, like we're talking strict visa policies. That's why they asked the travel question. Going to a couple countries that allow visa-free travel for your nationality doesn't really help. People are like, I was refused for previous travel. Remember, previous travel and international travel is not a requirement for a student visa, right? Student visa is about, or do you have academic intent? Can you realistically pay for it? And do you intend to leave the United States at the end of your studies? 1, 2, 3. Right? It's not about how many countries have you been to. Are you young? Are you single? Right? Nobody go out there and go to a country that you don't want to go to. Although like Jordan's really nice and Kuala Lumpur is really nice. Don't go to a country you don't want to go to just to boost your resume. Right? There's also, what does that tell me for a story? Someone shows up 3 months later. I've been on 2 trips in the region. That doesn't tell me anything. Now, if you're the kind of person who goes to a dozen countries a year, you travel the whole world, your passport's full of visas, that tells me something about your lifestyle. But that is not a major factor, right? Okay. That's not a major factor in a student visa interview. Is it because I was young and a student and unmarried? That's a problem? Well, it's not about are you unmarried. It's that you're a young man in a country whose economy is honestly not doing that great. And there's a lot of incentive to leave. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that's something that needs addressing about what's your plan afterwards. You know, there's a certain situations, especially when countries are having a hard time. And there's a lot of countries having a hard time right now. You know, is it about showing that you own a house? It's like, well, if you own a house, if you own 2 houses, you own 4 houses in a country that every young person is moving away from. Is that really a tie? Right. So I'd encourage, you know, for that question to not think about these kind of simple, if I do X, Y will happen. Think about the whole picture. Right. Think about the whole picture when you're talking about an F1 interview. You know, was I refused a B1, B2? Yeah, I was a kid. Right. What happened in the F1 visa? Well, did you talk about why you chose the school? Did you talk about how you'll pay for it? Did you talk about how that's an economic investment that pays off for you? Did you talk about your plans for the future? Because it's very different to say, like, my family owns a house in Pakistan and I got refused when I was a baby. And I've been to Jordan. Okay. I'm going to study this. I chose this school because it's a good mixture of affordability and, they're good and better than a couple other schools that I looked at in this particular area. My parents are funding this because they see it as an investment in my future. And, you know, for my future plans, I've actually been thinking about getting a job in my field in, Dubai. Right. Oh, well, that's a plan for the future. That's a source of money that makes sense. That's an explanation of previous refusals that explains what's happening in your life. These are the same situation explained very differently, right? Because remember, the standard in an American visa interview isn't, can you prove a piece of information with a document? Bluntly, the standard is, does the officer believe you, right? And the question people should be asking themselves is, hey, does this make sense? Right? Does this make sense? You know?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. We've crossed the hour. Joseph, do you have time for a couple more questions?
I have time for a couple more. I actually really miss this from being a visa officer.
Okay, this is awesome. You're doing great.
Yeah, we would do Q&As. Well, this is so much fun. Yeah.
All right, well, let's do a few more then before we wrap up, because there's great ones coming. Melvin drops the bomb here. What would you say is the number one reason for rejections?
Yeah, so the number one reason for rejections is basically it's not a communication of ties, but it's I doubt your intentions, right? Are you really gonna do that? Oh yeah, I'm going for my cousin's wedding. I'm coming right back. You know, I've issued visas to incredibly poor people. I've denied visas to millionaires, right? And that was because I didn't believe their intentions. I still remember this young rich guy from Mumbai, and really flashy, big watch, designer clothes. He comes up, and as we're talking to him, I'm just like, you're going to do some weird business thing that's not allowed on a B1, B2, aren't you? And I really looking through, I was like, I think you're going to pull some shady business deals of the kind that you need another type of visas. I'm not giving you a B1, B2. I don't think for a second that you're going to stop hustling. Right. Then fast forward 4 days later when he confronts me at a very nice restaurant in Poly Hill. And it's like, why did you deny my visa? And I was like, is he in the mafia? Right. That was not nice. But the reason I rejected that guy, I didn't believe his intentions, right? And it's
story didn't make sense.
The story didn't make sense. Oh, but officer, I have all that money in the bank. I don't believe that it makes sense that you'd spend your money on that, right? Yeah. I don't believe that's what you're really planning. So really, when you think about it, the number one reason for rejection is, I'm looking at the typical visa applicant in that country. I'm looking at the applicant. I'm trying to sort them into a demographic as fast as possible. What type of person are you going to act like? And then if something comes up where I don't really believe what you're saying, right? Or if I believe you're telling me something that's something you think you need to say to get a visa, it's gone. The trust is gone. I don't believe you. And that's the legal standard in this process, right? The officer is empowered to make a yes or no decision, especially with B's and F's and J's, right? That really their opinion is king.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. All right. Sajer is asking, does having travel history in North Korea, Russia, or maybe any country kind of at odds with America affect a B2 visa negatively?
It's also gonna matter why, right? I still remember the first time I saw a North Korean visa in a passport, right? And it was a guy in Calcutta who was a basketball player. And he was like, well, it's like an Asian Games thing. And we had a tournament. We went and played basketball in North Korea. And I was like, okay. Like, did you just play basketball? The rest of the story added up. right? What you're doing really matters, right? So if you're giving me a shady answer, like I think the number one problem is people get suspicious and they start acting suspicious, and then the officer gets suspicious, right? They're like, they think this problem, like a lot of Indians increasingly are going to Iran for tourism because there's really good food and there's really beautiful ancient architecture.
Yeah.
Hey, I wish I could go, right?
Yeah.
But aunties and uncles, they come back and they're like, I went to Iran, what's going to happen, right? Is there an explanation for that? I went on a package tour, I had some good rice, and I saw some old castles. Okay, that's fine, right? If you're going and being like, I'm a petrochemical engineer and I went to Iran, and that's a heavily sanctioned industry, then there's going to be a problem. If you went to Russia because it's easier to get a visa and it's a package tour and you just, love old Russian novels, that's fine. If you studied aerospace engineering in Russia, we want to have a little more of an involved conversation, right, about that, right? Because that is, a lot of Indians will go and do degrees in Russia. I had an interview once with a guy in Mumbai who was a naval officer, retired naval officer, very high ranking in the Indian military. And India has many allies and many friends. He's one of the only guys I ever met who attended both the U.S. Naval Academy and the Admiral Sergei Gorshkov Leningrad Soviet Naval Institute. He'd done both.
Whoa.
Right. Yeah. And so like that happened. This was someone who was trained by the Russian military. I had a couple questions about him, but there was a reason for that. Right. So don't sweat it. It's not an automatic refusal. For some people and some places, especially more for Europeans, it means like, hey, I want to talk to you. Like, you don't qualify for interview waiver. You're not doing a Dropbox renewal if you've been to North Korea. But as long as you can explain it and the reasons are fine and you're not doing anything illegal while you're there, then that's not an issue.
Great. Oliver's asking for some tips on how to fill out the DS-160 after a 214B denial to maybe help prove home ties for another time around.
Remember, it's not the proof, right? Like it's not proving home ties. It's explaining why you're going and why you'll come back. What I find the most valuable real estate in the DS-160, because the DS-160s, as an officer, you're barely looking at that thing. I got to be honest with you, right? You are so pressed for time. You're not looking for, so first of all, to make sure that officers don't play favorites, that they don't cheat the system, and there's no room for corruption, you don't get to see DS-160s before the interview. The first time I see you, talk to you, think about you, hear from you is when you walk up to my window, right? So I'm not reading these ahead of time. The questions we really care about are the ones that are like, have you ever traveled to North Korea, right? Are you a member of a terrorist organization? Do you have any training with high explosives, right? These are questions that are on there. We're looking for those, right? So you're looking through and you're looking to grievance stuff. You'll use it to kind of guide your questioning, maybe ping certain things. If there's discrepancies between what you say and what's in the DS-160, that's very bad, right? If it says I'm going to Houston, you say, oh, I'm going to California. What is going on? If I get the sense that you didn't fill out your DS-160, I'm going to kind of take that as you lying to me. But what's the real big space for opportunity with the DS-160 is, have you ever been refused a U.S. visa? Because that section is blank. You can put stuff in there. Don't put your whole life story, but what you want to do is you want to in there address your situation and reiterate and restate like what your purpose of travel is, right? Like, look, I'm not an intending immigrant. I just want to go and do X. I just want to go and do Y. I'm a business person with this net worth, right? A simple description of your circumstances, because as an officer, you got to check the DS-160. You're not going through every detail, but you do have to read it. Like actually in the visa system, they won't let you proceed unless you've read the whole DS-160. So you got to scroll through it. And if there's a nice, concise, simple kind of, this is it in there, then, like that can do a lot to introduce an idea to the officer, but it's not the space to provide proof. And it's not the space to say a lot, right? You want to make a short argument about why you qualify.
Great. We got a two-parter here from Azada from Afghanistan, who's studying in Turkey, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Going to Virginia Wesleyan with a good scholarship, has an aunt in the U.S. who can help sponsor because parents can't due to banking in Afghanistan. They also worked with a U.S. organization for 3 weeks as a teacher. Any of those things going to help them with chances of getting a U.S. visa?
So let's think about, what are the actual the actual qualifications, right, that you need for a US visa is basically like, why are you doing this from an academic perspective, right? How are you going to pay for this, and what kind of support do you have, and what are your plans afterwards? So first of all, Azada, congratulations. That's a really good school. That's a big scholarship, right? That's 2 out of 3 right there. Why are you going to Wesleyan? Well, because it's Wesleyan. This is a prestigious school. It's a lot of opportunity for me. But you don't say, I want to go to America. You don't say, I'm going there to see my aunt. You say, I'm going there to study. That is your goal. It is a student visa for studying, right? How are you paying this? I've got this scholarship. You've got people willing to support you. It's less about how does this money get to this place, go to here. People have ways of figuring that out, right? People have ways of making that happen, but it's less a mechanical, how does this money transit to this country? And it's more, what does it mean for this money to be spent on you, right? Less important than the dollar value of the scholarship is what's the percentage of a scholarship, right? Like 24,000 is very good. If your school is only costing $36,000 a year, that's great. That's a huge scholarship proportionally. If you still have 60%, 50% left, well, where's that money coming from, and what does it mean for you to invest it? What I'm seeing missing from this concern, and like working with a previous U.S. organization, that's good, but it doesn't really affect this type of visa. What I'm seeing missing from this plan is what's going on after this, right? Now,
future after graduation,
future stuff, and remember, a lot of people think I need to show ties to my home country. This is especially for people from countries that are having a bit of a hard time. But you're studying in Turkey. I'm sure you're at a good university in Turkey if you're at a good university in the USA. You don't have to show that you're going back to your country. You just have to explain that your desire is not to use the visa to immigrate to the United States. So if you're like, I love living in Turkey, I want to go back and start a company there. I want to go and work in my field in another country. That's a pretty valid answer. For you, I frankly mostly worry about immigration intent questions, and explaining your future plans is the best way to actually answer that.
Okay. Solo saying, does having a travel history of 3 to 4 countries improve your chances of getting a J1 visa, or does travel history help student visas?
To an extent, but I think I answered this previously. It's really going to depend which countries and how strict their visa regimes are. Right. We never really counted to visit to Thailand. Thailand it's a big tourism country. They love tourism. It's pretty easy to get a Thai visa for a lot of nationalities. That doesn't really count for a lot, But if you're like, oh yeah, I consistently go to Norway, right? Or I consistently visit Australia or New Zealand, that counts for a lot because those are very difficult visas to get. So it's going to depend.
Great. My friends, this has been incredible. Make sure you say thank you, give some love to Josef in the comments, or hit that like button. We've got the links for you guys to connect with Argo, to get coaching, get mock interviews, avail their resources. Josef, thank you so much for spending your time and sharing your expertise and hopefully alleviating some fears from our friends today.
Yeah, I hope this lets people know a little bit more kind of what's likely to happen. The news is not always good. I'm not saying a lot of great things. Do I personally love the way immigration policy is heading? Not necessarily, but that doesn't mean you should panic, right? And it means that you should know where you stand and focus on the basics. I love hearing all your questions. These were really great questions, and it was great to hang out and chat with everyone.
Yeah, and again, if we didn't get to all your questions today, so sorry, but again, go to the recording of this, put them in the comments, and we'll try and follow up with more of those later. Thanks so much for tuning in today, guys. This was so much fun. We love having you part of the Chai coaching community. Be sure to check out our friends with Argo Visa, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully we'll do another live session in February. Cheers, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.